This video is based on deflation, and when considering the macroeconomic objective of stable prices, we shouldn't just consider inflation, but we should consider the possibility of deflation, especially over the last few years where deflation is becoming more common in certain countries. And we've experienced it across Europe. Japan have experienced it for a very long time, even the likes of Switzerland. So what this video is delving into is what exactly is deflation, the different types of deflation, what can cause it, the advantages and the disadvantages of deflation, and then some real-life examples. So the definition, as it says here, price deflation happens when the rate of inflation becomes negative. So this is when prices are falling, okay? And because prices are falling, then the value of money is going up, and therefore purchasing power is increasing. Now, there's two different types of deflation. We've got benign deflation and malign deflation. And if we're looking at benign deflation, we can associate this with this one here, this diagram here, with the long-run aggregate supply shifting from 1 to 2, meaning probably because of increased productivity or increased factors of production in some way. And what that has meant is that price level has dropped from P1 to P2. Now, this is an absolutely fine deflation. The reason for that is because the deflation is caused because of improvements in the productive potential or the productive capacity of the economy. So as I've put here, falling prices are caused by higher productivity, as happened in the late 19th century. They can go hand in hand with robust growth. So if the falling prices are simply the result of improving technology or better managerial practices, then that is not really a worry. It's fine. However, the other deflation is a worry, because what this relates to is this diagram here, where we can see AD1 shift to AD2. And that means that there's a lack of demand within the economy. And the reason why price levels fallen is because the lack of demand is creating a huge excess of capacity. So as I put here, malign deflation occurs when prices fall because of a structural lack of demand, which creates huge excess capacity in an economic system. If there is a slump in demand, companies go out of business and they may have to make people redundant, and hence demand falls again. So the negative multiplier keeps on occurring. So it's like a vicious cycle. It just carries on getting worse and worse. And we've seen moments of this in the 1930s, which you can go on to research. But if we're thinking about the evaluation of these different types of deflation, and if there's a question which was looking at, is deflation always negative for an economy, then we could say, well, it depends on the type of deflation. If it's benign deflation, then no, it doesn't have to be bad for the economy. In fact, it shows that the economy is performing very efficiently, and that's why price level is falling. However, if it's due to malign deflation, then actually, yes, it is bad for the economy, because it suggests that for whatever reason, AD is falling. And if AD is falling, then we'll see that national output and national income is also falling, and that is what's causing the price level to shift. So just a reminder, if it's a benign deflation, we want to show a shift of long-run aggregate supply 1 to long-run aggregate supply 2, just to show that because of the increased capacity, price levels falling. And if it's malign deflation, then what we want to do is we want to show that shift of AD1 to AD2. And as we can see, if we think about a Keynesian viewpoint, that means there's much more excess capacity within the economy. The economy is not performing efficiently, and that's why we can see that price levels are actually falling because of the excess output. So now what we have to do is consider the consequences of deflation. As with any economic factor, there are positives and there are negatives. And it also, I suppose, a massive evaluation point is it depends on the rate of deflation, and it also depends on the scale of deflation. Is it how long has it been happening for? So if we look at the consequences, the negative consequences of deflation, one of the biggest issues is the waiting game. And what I mean by that is, if we know that price level is falling, and if consumers know that price level is falling, then consumers are going to want to hold on to their money to wait for prices to fall further. They won't want to rush into purchases because they know, well, what's the point? Because maybe moments down the line, I can actually get that product or I can get that service for a cheaper price. So they wait and they hold off from consuming. And because they're holding off from consuming, then it's obviously going to negatively impact aggregate demand within the economy, and AD will fall. Now, if consumers are not purchasing, then obviously businesses are not experiencing demand. Their sales revenue is going to be falling. So it can be really detrimental to firms as well. And firms might worry about what that means in terms of their profit margins, I suppose in terms of their financial stability. Will they have to be forced to make cuts in costs? So for example, redundancies to labour if they keep experiencing this low demand. Also, it does bring about a lot of instability within the economy. Not only, I suppose, businesses are worried about these prices dropping. They don't always consider it in terms of their inputs, but they consider it in terms of their revenue. And they think that if consumers, for example, are waiting and not buying, then they have got negative confidence within the economy. They are worried. They're thinking, should we really be investing at this point in time with demand falling? So there is negative consequences, and also in terms of if employees are being made redundant because of the lack of purchasing and lack of demand and lack of AD, then we could also think about individuals' confidence in the economy. We also have to consider in terms of debt. So because the value of money goes up when we see deflation, the value of debt or the money that you've borrowed will also be higher. So therefore, you might have to be paying more debt back. And also, if you want to borrow, if the rate of interest may appear higher because of that deflation as well. So what we tend to say is when there's deflation, what we find is it's probably actually worse to borrow because the debt will seem much larger, especially if you've already borrowed in the past and you've still got that outstanding payments and maybe you haven't got a fixed term agreement. Now, some of the other issues and just in general I've got here. So holding back on spending, as I've already said, consumers may postpone demand if they expect prices to fall in the future. Debts increase, as I've just mentioned. The real value of debt rises with deflation, and higher real debts can be a big drag on consumer confidence. The real cost of borrowing increases, again, as I've mentioned, and possibly real interest rates will rise if nominal rates of interest do not fall in line with prices. So if the interest rate remains the same, then actually it's actually gotten bigger in terms of real terms. Because what you should find, or what you'd hope to find, is that the interest rate falls with the price level. But if it doesn't, then the interest rate seems so much higher. Lower profit margins, lower prices can mean reduced revenues and profits for businesses. This again can lead to higher unemployment as firms seek to reduce costs by shedding labour. It also can mean that wage growth falls and possibly frozen recruitment, frozen wages, and we don't see a real wage growth when we see deflation. Again, confidence in savings, falling asset prices. Think about the wealth effect. If your asset value is again falling in terms of price level, then you might feel less wealthy, less confident. But also, I suppose it depends on your financial situation as well. And in terms of, if deflation is not going to last that long, then it might not massively impact your confidence. And especially if you're not in a position to maybe sell your house and you're not looking to sell, then actually it might not have an impact. So again, just remember, for every analytical point that you make, you should be evaluating as well. How long is this deflation going to last? If it's not going to last that long and the forecasts are we'll get out of that deflation pretty soon, then again, some of these points might not actually be necessarily significant. There are also some benefits of deflation. So if we think about the top picture and we think about balance of payments, actually, when we see price levels falling, it might make us internationally more competitive. The reason for that is obviously other countries will view our goods as being cheaper, and therefore they'll be more attracted to making purchases, and therefore our exports should rise. Also at the same point, domestic customers may think, okay, if prices are falling, I'd rather buy domestic goods than imports because imports might appear more expensive in comparison to domestic goods. So what you may find is actually the balance of payment improves. It could do, but again, I suppose it depends on international competition. Just because our price levels are falling doesn't mean that they're less than our competitors and other countries. So we just have to view that. Again, another benefit is actually equality. I suppose this sometimes depends on how long this is going on for and the types of goods that we're considering within deflation. But if we've got for example, maybe lower income, they may see the benefits of deflation because some of their goods will appear cheaper, especially if we consider the rates of, there's a term called joyflation, where we think about all the necessities that will be falling in price that all of us need to buy. Then that'll be good for the lower income because they'll be able to afford it and they'll have more disposable income. And at the same time, the higher income are probably not going to buy more necessities because they won't need them. They'll keep on buying the same amount. So with necessities, we'll see quite a lot of equality within that. So as I've put, income distribution deflation leads to redistribution of income from debtors to creditors, but debtors may then default on loans. Deflation, they can make exporters more competitive eventually, but this often comes at a cost, i.e. higher unemployment in the short term. Now remember, this depends on the type of deflation as well. I mean, if we're looking at, for example, benign deflation, then some of these negative consequences to these advantages might not take place. So in terms of higher unemployment in the short term, that might not actually be true, okay? And the only time that we'd see higher unemployment in the short term is if it was malign deflation because of obviously falls in demand. But then, depending on the time lag, if then the demand for exports go up, then hopefully we'd see increase in employment. Now, one of the best examples of deflation in terms of looking at countries is Japan, because Japan have been experiencing deflation for quite a considerable amount of time. So what we'll quickly do is we'll just look at Japan's scenario and we'll look at some of the advantages and disadvantages we mentioned before and relate it to the Japanese situation. So if we look at this graph from Japan's CPI, we can see that they've experienced quite considerable deflation throughout from 1995 up until recently. So again, how have they handled it? Has there been positives or has there been drawbacks? Now, one of the biggest issues has been the impact to growth. If we look at Japan's nominal GDP, we can see that from the 1980s up until 2010 to 2013, 14, 15, their growth has been quite limited. It hasn't really grown that much, especially from the 90s, okay? So from the 90s up until recently, their growth has been quite stagnant, okay? It's not really, if we consider, for example, America's growth has been triple what Japan's been in terms of growth rates. So Japan, you could argue, and again, the Japanese government will argue this, that their deflation has limited growth, and that's been an issue. Japan has seen some benefits. Different industries have seen benefits. So, for example, discount stores that sell inferior goods have seen higher demands. So, for example, the equivalent of the pound shops in the UK, they've got their own discount stores. They've seen a much larger increase in demand, and it's created like a brand new kind of industry within the retailing sector. But also, I mean, that's probably one positive, but mostly it has brought about disadvantages, especially in terms of wage growth. Wage growth has been very, very limited, if not, it's been falling. So that's been a problem for the Japanese economy. Now, how have they tried to come out of this? They're still trying. They're still putting in lots of different policies to try and help with this, and they've still got the inflation target of 2%. So in Japan, they've carried out a policy of actually reducing interest rates so much that they've become negative, and they've been using quite a controversial method called quantitative easing. Now, quantitative easing it's quite a complex unit, and it is more related to A2, but I'll go through it now. Now, I've done a step-by-step guide as to how they carry out quantitative easing. So first of all, the whole principle of it is creating almost like electronic money. So what they do is they create money by buying securities such as government bonds or even financial assets from different companies, commercial assets, but mostly from banking institutes. So therefore, with electronic cash that did not exist before, so this electronic cash is being made. It's quite similar to I suppose printing money, but instead of printing it, they're doing it electronically, and they're just adding it to their balance sheets. So what their balance sheet was before and what it is now, the balance sheet will be higher because what they've done is they've included this electronic cash that they've created. So by buying these bonds, what they're doing is they should be trying to stimulate the economy by supplying money to, for example, the government and to banks. Now, if the banks have got this money from these bonds that the central bank has bought from them, because obviously the bonds is like a certificate, it's kind of like an IOU certificate, and if they buy it from, for example, a bank, then the Bank of England will be giving the bank the money for this bond. So the bank will get that money, and therefore their reserves will be much greater because they've got more of an injection from the central bank. So the idea is that the banks take this new money and then buy assets to replace the ones that they've sold to the central bank. It raises stock prices, lowers interest rates, which in turn boosts investments. Now, what you just have to remember is the whole idea of quantitative easing is to stimulate borrowing within the economy, because what they want is they want banks to be less cautious when giving out loans to encourage borrowing. So then when consumers are borrowing, obviously they're borrowing to spend. Now, when you're looking at bonds, you have to look at bonds, the bond price itself, but also the yield return. Now, the yield return is almost like an interest rate on that bond. So what you tend to find is if there's high demand for bonds, then the bond price goes up and the yield return goes down. Now, there's always an inverse relationship. So, for example, if the bond price goes down, the yield return will go up. Now, if demand for bonds go up, it'll push prices up and mean yields will fall. And what that does, it lowers the rate of interest. So that is how interest rates are falling. So the more bonds that they buy, then the yield goes down and it reduces the interest rates. Now, just to finish off this video, just remember evaluative points. So first of all, how much deflation is taking place? Was it expected? Was it forecasted? Did they know? So could they plan and could they prepare for it? How short is this period of deflation is it going to be? What is the state of economic growth at this moment in time, and what is the cause of this deflation? Is it malign or is it benign? So they're the type of evaluation points that you should be considering. One important term that I would look at is in terms of joyflation, because joyflation relates to necessities and it relates to the benefits and the short-term benefits that the economy can gain from these price levels falling in terms of necessity goods, especially for low income, and boosting maybe standard of living. But just be careful of the deflation spiral that can take place as well when we're thinking about, for example, the waiting game, and we think about maybe these luxury goods or these other goods that are not being purchased because consumers are waiting for them to fall. And finally, another important point which I did miss out earlier, sometimes policies don't always work with deflation. Sometimes, for example, if you think about reducing interest rates to try to accelerate spending and try to encourage customers to stop saving and start spending. That's all well and good, but if you keep your money in the bank and prices are falling, then actually, even if the interest rate was, for example, 0, then there's no incentive to really spend it, because even at an interest rate of 0, the longer it stays in the bank and the more deflation that's taking place, then your money will be worth more the longer it's kept in that bank. So sometimes certain policies are not working, and that's why we've got maybe countries like Japan trying to think of new ways to try and improve deflation and try to bring to increase prices. In terms of negative interest rates, again, that's offering very, very cheap loans. And has it helped? Well, some countries may argue it has helped, but for how long and to what degree, okay? So just have a little think about that as well.